Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Alfred Ironside. I'm the Director of Communications here at the Ford Foundation. And on behalf of our President, Luis Ubiñas, and everyone here at the Ford Foundation, welcome to all of you in this room and all of you watching around the country. We know there are a couple of hundred of you, so welcome. We are very, very pleased to host this conversation between Ira and Sendhil today. For 5 reasons. One, we're huge fans of Ira, so thank you very much for being here today. 2, we're huge fans of Sendhil's, and we're delighted and honored to be able to support the work you're doing at Harvard. 3, we're very, very fond of Spitfire Strategies, our friends and colleagues there whom we work with very often. And 4, of course, we're huge fans of the Communications Network, not just because I serve on the board, but also because of the tremendous work they're doing to advance the practice of strategic communications for foundations and nonprofits. Finally, and most importantly, we at Ford are real believers in the power and potential of strategic communications generally, to advance the work we're all doing. And we believe that there is both an art and a science to communications, so we're interested today in getting smarter about both. So that's my welcome. Thank you all for being here. And now let me turn it over to our friends from Spitfire Strategies in the presence of Pete Rafel.
Thank you, Alfred. And I want to extend Spitfire's gratitude to the Ford Foundation for loaning us this extraordinary venue for today's talk. For those of you who haven't heard of Spitfire, we're a strategic communications consulting firm that works only with nonprofits and foundations who, like the Ford Foundation and like many of you, are working to advance positive social change in the world. And the tools that we use and the techniques that we share with our clients are rooted in a scientific understanding of how the mind interacts with messages to understand and process information. Tools like the SMART chart and our publication Discovering the Activation Point are based not only on our real world experience working with our clients, but also on the latest research on the science of communications and cognition. So it was a natural that we would partner with the Communications Network on a series of talks with the people who are doing that work and doing that research on the cutting edge of the science of communications. And so today's lecture is the latest in that series. These are brought to you through generous funding from the Brainerd Foundation. And who better to be our guide in this land of the bleeding edge of science than Ira Flatow, the 2 decades now host of Science Friday, which brings us the latest science on everything from the crystalline structure of snowflakes to the countdown to the asteroid going by this week. I'm a big fan, and it's an honor and a privilege to welcome Ira Flatow here, and I think I'll just hand it over to you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to open up the afternoon and just give you a few remarks about what we do at Science Friday in our careers and how we basically intersect with your missions here at Ford and also at Spitfire. I've been in this business, I hate to tell you how long I've been in this business, but it's over 40 years. I was 5 when I started doing this. And I've been fortunate enough to meet and interview and greet some of the brightest, most intelligent scientists in the world, to talk to some great audiences, talk to people who are very inquisitive about science, and who they are would surprise you. But as you heard, we've talked about just about everything there is in the universe about science. But what intrigues me the most about science, and when we talk about it, is what people believe and why they believe what they believe. And you might think you know why people believe or what they bring with them to the table, and it really influences what they take away. I know, for example, as a communicator, it's very important that we talk about our latest findings. That could be stem cells, global warming, whatever, and we present the evidence, we present the science. But what people take away from what they hear is not the same thing that we present to them. They will bring biases with them to the table, to the radio, to the podcast, to our website, whichever they're going to. And they will pick and choose among the research that we bring to them and pick out what they want to believe in and discard the rest of the stuff as, well, they're not qualified to tell me what they're talking about because I do not choose to believe that kind of thing. For example, one of our prime cases was autism and vaccination. You know the controversy about that. We had a scientist on who has studied this for decades, and he brought along with him 1,000 references. And we talked about the connection or the non-connection between autism, the research showing no connection between vaccinations and autism. And we got a call from a caller, and she said, I want to tell you I don't believe anything that you're saying. I don't believe in any of this research. I said, but we're presenting hundreds, thousands of papers. And she said, and she went on for about 10 minutes. And my producers and directors said, cut her off, cut her off. I said, no, you have to listen to this. This is a valid point of view from someone who's involved. And I let her speak for about 10 minutes. And when she was done, I said, is there any amount of data, any amount of information piled up high at any time, any form, at any place that we could present to you on this program to change your mind? And she said, no. I said, thank you very much. And that is one of the problems of science communication. On the other hand, the public loves to talk about science. I've been doing this, Science Friday now is in its 22nd year, and as much time as we can give science, they will talk about it. They love to learn new things. They don't have the slightest idea what a scientist does. They don't. But they like science, and they want to find out what scientists do, and that's what we believe as our mission as Science Friday Initiative, our nonprofit. Our mission is to bring science, scientists, and the public together so we can create this dialogue, and they see these are real breathing people and talking about science and interacting with them, and they can speak English, at least the ones that we bring on the radio to talk about it. And we had last week an incident that shows at least that we're making some progress. A caller to the program, to Talk of the Nation, during the earlier part of the week, not to Science Friday, they were talking about things that changed their lives. And a young man called up and he said, in 2006, I listened. I was a construction worker, and I listened on the job. I listened to Science Friday every Friday in a parking lot in my truck. And I heard an interview that you and Sylvia Earle, the marine biologist, did, and she was so inspiring that she inspired me to go back to school. I got 2 undergraduate degrees, and I'm now working on my master's degree in science, just because of that one interview. I sent that to Sylvia. She got a good kick out of that. But it does show that you can make a difference. You can make a difference if you really want to and continue to do so. So how people make decisions, how they decide to listen to you, how they do what what they do because of what they hear, is so intriguing that really is the work of our speaker this afternoon, behavior economist and Harvard professor Sendhil Mullainathan. Dr. Mullainathan studies how we actually make decisions and the psychology involved. We tend to assume that people are driven by rational thought. You present the evidence to them, they're going to make a rational decision. Sendhil's going to talk a little bit about that. He argues that the decisions are driven by on-the-moment things that happen. And many programs or fixes to social problems are going to be flawed because we really don't understand human behavior as we should do. And as a journalist, I'm constantly amazed by these decisions that fly in the face of critical thinking. And Sendhil's research and work seeks to pinpoint the irrational choices we make that perpetuate poverty, perpetuate corruption, and perpetuate disease. He has a bold agenda. He wants to use these insights in behavioral economics to improve how we tackle poverty, how we tackle some of the other issues facing our world, maybe climate change. And when we think about some of the most vexing problems, AIDS, infant mortality, climate change, universal education, even an asteroid with our name on it that's going to hit us someday. We ducked a couple of this week. We have a number of brilliant ideas, and Sendhil has a number of brilliant solutions to help solve them. But yet, we have talked about these ideas over the years. Why have we not done anything for many of them. Sendhil's going to talk a little bit about why that is. He wants to know, why do good solutions fail? You've all had good solutions. You've all had good ideas. Why do they fail? He emphasizes the influence that the brain, how our brain works, has on all of us in making that happen. Things like willpower, procrastination, trade-offs, all kinds of stuff that go on in our heads influence what we do. And I want to also ask him later about, how does social networking now influence what we do? Because there's a lot of research that shows what your friends tell you to do can influence what you'll do, even if you don't think it does. Look at the last election as an example of how that happened a little bit. And he's certainly not toiling away just in that ivory tower at Harvard. He's a professor of economics there. He has created a nonprofit called Ideas 42, which applies those ideas to the real world. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to him. He was appointed by the U.S. Treasury Department to serve as senior researcher at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He is a recipient of the MacArthur Genius Award, the MacArthur Foundation Genius Award that none of us will ever win, but he's got one. He's got numerous other grants and fellowships from the National Science Foundation, the Olin Foundation, the Sloan Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation. And with that, I turn it over to you, Professor Sendhil.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming out. I'm gonna take a small topic today. I'm gonna solve social problems. Let's just talk concretely. Let's start with climate change. One of the interesting things I find working in the sphere is, when you think of a problem like climate change, we often look for technological solutions, improvements in energy efficiency, any new ways of getting energy from the ground. But in some sense, what's striking is how the technologies we already have are not fully used. For example, if people set their thermostats, we would save a whole lot of energy. And I'm going to show you some data on this. Take another problem, global health. We're looking for ways to deal with all these diseases that are coming around, yet vaccination rates are still pretty low for a lot of diseases. And that's not lack of supply of vaccines. That's because in lots of areas, people aren't using vaccines. It's just one example. Take education. You can see where this is going. In each of these areas, a lot of good solutions have behavior at their impediment. And at the back of that is the human brain. There's a great study that shows that if you show an MRI, people believe what you say more. So I really should have shown an MRI. This is the best I could do because I'm not a real scientist. Now, what do we know about the human brain? Well, I think often people implicitly, without realizing it, assume something like this about the human brain. I hope you all know who this is. Thank God. My students do not always know who this is. That's disturbing in its own way. Now, what's interesting is when behavioral economics is cast, it's often cast as somehow saying, no, this is the human brain. And I hope you know who this is, too. And I think that's wrong. I think it's wrong to think of people as stupid. I think a better model of the human brain is this. This is Brad Pitt, who has made an odd choice. And that's probably a good summary of humans. Brad Pitt is otherwise a reasonable person. He's not Homer Simpson, but he can make some odd choices. Now, what are those odd choices like? And how our understanding of those odd choices can make a big difference. Let me pause before going to this and give you all a puzzle. If you've seen this before, don't say, oh, I have the answer. But if you haven't, this is a pencil, and that is wood. And as you can see, these are two shots of this. The pencil is inside the wood. It's free moving. My question to you is, how did I get the pencil in there? Any ideas? You can shout out a potential answer. Sure. Right. You could say, now, I should tell you, I did not, this is one whole piece of wood. I did not cut it. I did not do anything to that piece of wood. So I didn't break the wood in half and re-glue it together. And I did not break, I know I'm an economist, but I'm not a cheater. I did not break the pencil in half either. There's a whole pencil right in there. How did I get it in there?
Was the wooden structure built around the pencil?
Now, if I had that kind of skill, I would not be here giving this talk. I would be making amazing pieces of art somewhere. So no, I did not do that either. Photoshop. You guys are really convinced that I'm a cheater. I did not cheat. Let me give you a clue, a hint, so to speak. Any ideas now? Does that help somebody? The pencil's made out of a sponge. Close. Wood is like a sponge. Any wood, if you wet it, becomes very flexible. So of course, I soaked the wood in water, I flexed it, I put the pencil in, and dried, and now I have what looks to be an impossible thing. Why am I telling you this? Not to show off. I'm telling you this because this represents something for me important about the way we understand humans and ourselves. When we have the wrong model of a situation, we don't even know to ask the right questions. In this case, we had a model of wood as a solid object, and an object that cannot be bent. Now, that's roughly right. Of course, if you sit on a chair, as you all are doing right now, you better hope it's solid. But it's only roughly right. In some cases, like when wood is wet, it's wrong. And our models of human behavior are very similar. They're roughly right. They have some truth in them. We're not completely wrong. But they overlook a bunch of things, such as what happens when the wood gets wet. And today I want to just give you some sense of things that you are overlooking about people, and thereby not even asking the right question, not even thinking about what to do. Okay. So what are the things that what's the equivalent of the sponge for the brain? This is getting very metaphorical. I'm going to show you three things. The first is, I didn't know where to put, of the three things I wanted to show you, I didn't know where to put this because this is probably the most extreme thing to say in something called a communications network. So I'm going to start by arguing to you that a lot of when we communicate, we're preaching to the converted, and that maybe we ought not to be communicating at all. What do I mean by that? I want to start with a problem, one of my favorite problems. My undergrads do not get up on time. They don't get enough sleep. They can get 2-3 hours of sleep during exam period. They just don't sleep very well. And sometimes it's about going to bed on time. Sometimes they just don't get up on time. Okay. What can we do about it? Well, one of the things we can do is communicate to them. This is sleepeducation.com. We can teach them the benefits of getting up on time. And of like going to sleep on time. You can see here, get out of bed, stay out of bed, limit naps, avoid caffeine, wake up on the weekend. This is the communications approach to this problem. Now, I'm not saying this is not good. Obviously, people need to know these things. But even after all this has been communicated, something else is left over. What's left over? Well, let me tell you my own problem. And actually, why should I make this personal? Let me tell you your problem. Think about what time you woke up this morning. Okay. Now, think about what time you plan to get up this morning. There's a pretty big gap between those two numbers. Like, you might have planned to get up at 7 a.m., go for a run, read some French poetry, in the original French, of course, and then read the newspaper. 7 o'clock came, and you felt like, I don't want to get up at 7. I want someone else to get up, maybe 7:08 a.m. self. So you hit the snooze bar, waited 8 minutes, and the thing went on for a while. That's because you have a problem. You have a problem of self-control. Self-control is one of the most basic problems. Notice this is not going to be solved by communication. Now, I'm just going to show you a video because this is purely gratuitous. I will tell you that right now, because this is a more fun video than me talking. This is one of the early experiments on self-control that's been recreated. This is called the marshmallow experiment. Have all of you seen this? If so, I can skip the video. I'll show you the video anyway because it's fun. The kid is given one marshmallow, and they're told, you can have it. I'm leaving the room. If by the time I get back you have not eaten it, you get 2 marshmallows. So these kids are sitting there trying to not eat the marshmallow. And that kid is making a huge mistake, as you can see. I'm going to pause it there because we need to see. So why is this important? Sorry, let me pause there for a second. Why is this important? Whoa. This is important because the solutions we would seek to self-control, and that's what I mean about preaching to the converted. I know I want to get up at 7. I'm the one who set the alarm clock. My problem is not you telling me, get up at 7, Sendhil. I know that. My problem is 7 a.m. self. That's the jerk we all should be talking to. And here's an example of a funny device that talks to that jerk. This is an alarm clock. What it does is it rolls off the bed, and it goes into some random corner, and then starts beeping. And what does this alarm clock do? It's not a communication solution. It's a solution that changes the nature of the intimate contest for the self. It tilts the balance of power towards evening self. The one who sets this alarm clock now has a great deal of power in the situation. Morning self is a little more powerless. So that's an example. Let me tell you another example of a different solution. We know that one of the biggest problems in health, in fact, remarkably under-discussed, one of the biggest problems in health, a big driver of health expenditures, is not overutilization, but underutilization. If diabetics took their medication, we'd save a lot of money. If people on statins took their medication, we'd save a lot of money. A lot of cheap drugs would allow us to save a whole lot of money. So that's the problem. Again, we can imagine communication solutions. We could tell people, hey, these are all the benefits of drugs. In fact, we try and do that. Or we could look for other solutions. One solution is we could look back to this thing, the pill bottle. And we could say, well, that's a funny device. Maybe we should update it. And this company called GlowCaps has done exactly that. Their realization is that most people, diabetics, want to take their pills. They don't need to be told about the benefits. They're like evening self and morning self. They want to take it. But life gets in the way. So what does GlowCaps do? Well, GlowCaps, as the name suggests, is like a passive-aggressive friend. If it doesn't get the attention that it needs for the day, like you're supposed to take your pill once a day, if you don't open that top of the bottle, it starts glowing and beeping. And then, if that's not enough, it starts sending text messages to your phone. And you can see the escalation here. If that's not enough, it's sending text messages to your mother. Hey, I haven't seen Sendhil for a while. How's he doing? So it can escalate a little too much. Now, in clinical trials, this has had an enormous impact. It's up to about, they call it 100%, but depending on how you measure it, let's call it 90% adherence, which is a striking gain. This is amongst the biggest gains I've ever seen in an adherence trial. There's no communication attempt here. It's just changing the situation to make it easier. Let me give you another example. Financial aid forms. Do you all know this? Yes. Yeah, wow, that was amazing. Just from the word FAFSA forms, you all went, yes, indeed. So this is a project that was done at H&R Block with low-income filers. Now, for you guys, it's a pain. For the low income, this is the difference between being able to have the money to go to school and not being able to go to school. So in this population, about 40% of the eligibles completed the FAFSA forms, and about 26.8% actually went to college. Okay? So the researchers decided to tell people, look, you have this benefit available. This is thousands of dollars a year. And it had no effect. Telling them the benefit had very little. Then they said, oh, what if instead of telling them, we also did something for them? Now, they're at the tax site. They just filled out their tax forms. You could copy for them from the tax form to the FAFSA form. This is literally copying. It's not fun, but that's all it is. You do that, and FAFSA completion rate goes up 14 percentage points. The number of low-income children going to college goes up by 7 percentage points. Now, if you're keeping score and you have a sense of magnitude, 7 percentage points enrollment increases amongst the low income would be amazing. And this is a large-scale randomized control trial. This is probably roughly the number we would get if we were to scale this program up. Not because we told them of the benefits. They kind of already knew of the benefits. But because we actually got rid of that last hurdle. Here's another example of communication versus action. There was a great study done, this is on now into the eating area. There's a great study done at a Chinese restaurant where all they did was, this is an all-you-can-eat buffet, they changed the size of the plate. And they found that increased the plate by about 33%, and you increase the amount of food eaten by about 20%. Just plate size alone, because, well, you're not paying much attention, and you're simply, now no attempt was made to get people to eat more or less, but a simple change. Okay, so let me stop this first element and simply just say, normally, we focus on informing, persuading, communicating. And I think that has a problem. I think that has a problem. Now I'm going to show you my favorite slide ever. I use this in every talk because I like it. That has a problem because it operates on intentions. It operates on getting us to want to do something. And this slide, for me, is the epitome of how intentions don't always translate into actions. These gentlemen, they may have an intention for working out, but as you can see, not all their actions follow through. So what that means is, when we think about moving intentions with the urge of translating actions, that doesn't always happen. I just learned how to use PowerPoint animation, so I just said I've never used it before. Instead, we can operate directly on actions. You can remind people things. You can make self-control easier. You can remove snags. There are many things that we can do to change behavior that are not simply inform, persuade, and communicate. Because for many problems, people will already have been persuaded. And we should not look at their lack of action and say, oh, they don't understand. That's the first one. Now let me tell you a second one. I'm going to argue to you that one of the problems all of you face in this room, and all of us, well, my students would argue I don't have this problem, but all of you face is that you know too much. What do I mean by that? Well, let me go back to a very old experiment. This is an example of this experiment, in which this is done on children, in which the children are shown a doll and says, this is Sally, and this is Anne. Sally puts her ball in the basket. When Sally goes away, Anne is not a very nice child. She moves the doll from the basket to the box. Then you ask the child the question, where will Sally look for her ball when she comes back? Now, obviously, I hope all of you can answer this question. This is an easy one. In some sense, the ball is in the box. The child knows that. But from Sally's perspective, the ball should be in the basket. And in fact, after a certain age, 3, 4 years old, almost all children say, oh, of course, she's going to look in the basket. Before that age, they all say, oh, she's going to look in the box. Why do they all say she's going to look in the box? Because they cannot move out of their own frame of reference, out of their own knowledge, and project themselves into the mind of other people. Now, you're all going to tell me you're older than 4, so this is not relevant for you. But I'm going to argue, in fact, this is still relevant for you. That yes, you know how to answer the Sally Ann problem, but you are still suffering from the Sally Ann problem every day. What's an example of this? So let's start with this email. I want to send this email out. I was asked to do something. I'm not going to do that again. I said sure, because the last time was so much fun. Clearly, I'm being sarcastic. But is the other person going to understand that I'm being sarcastic? So there's a good study done on this in which they showed people phrases like this, emails like this, and they said, will the other person detect the sarcasm? Then they showed it to the other person and asked them, what do you think of this email? So now we know your prediction. This is a Sally Ann moment. Have I predicted outside of myself into the other person very well? And here's an example. On email, about 88% of people say, oh, of course they'll detect sarcasm on messages like this. Only about 63% of people get it right. And this is what psychologists call egocentric bias. You have an inability to look past what you already know. I know this message is sarcastic, and project myself into others. You can imagine the challenge of communication this causes, so I'm going to talk about that in a second. One footnote on this study, which I really like, they did this with email, voice, and face-to-face. Of course, people's ability to detect sarcasm goes up across these media, but we're pretty insensitive to this. We think people will detect sarcasm on email, face-to-face, voice. It doesn't really matter. They'll know I'm being sarcastic. And in fact, they don't know you're being sarcastic. So if you get nothing else from this talk, stop being sarcastic on email. Another version of this, which I'll tell you just because it's funny. Do you all know deep thoughts? This is a great, these are examples of deep thoughts. You can read them. So the subjects were given 10 deep thoughts and asked to pick 5 that they really liked. Okay? And then they were asked, we're going to show this 5, the ones you pick that are really funny, we're going to show them to somebody else. And we're going to ask the question, is it funny? So first we're going to ask you, how funny do you find it? And most people say, oh, they're great. They're really terrific, especially since I picked the 5 that I really liked. Okay, how funny will someone else find it? Of course they'll find it funny. This is hilarious stuff. And no, they don't actually find it funny. And the reason is the same thing. You have picked, you have pre-selected. Now, I hope you see where I'm going with this. Where I'm going with this is that so much of the problem is one of perspective. The same thing, looked from a different perspective, looks very, very, very different. The person sitting here is trying to talk about circles, and the other person's thinking rectangles. So I'll leave you with this last deep thought from Jack Handey, which I really like. Before you criticize someone, you should walk a mile in their shoes. That way, when you criticize them, you're a mile away and you have their shoes. And that, I think, is pretty relevant for the use of this material in communication. I would argue egocentric bias, the curse of knowledge, is what makes communication so hard. Why? Because we often have experts in the business of communicating with non-experts. And they do not bridge the gap at all. They think, oh yeah, I've kind of overcome it, as Sally Ann may. I'll give an example. Take payday loans. Payday loans have lots of problems. One problem with payday loans is that the interest rates are really, really high. What should we do about this? Why don't we tell people the interest rates are really high? Look, this is a payday loan. If you borrow from here, your median annual interest rate is 443%. Use your credit card, 16%. That's pretty good. That's not good at all. Nobody knows what a percent is. Nobody knows what an APR is. These make no sense to most people. That's egocentric bias. That's the Sally Ann problem. You're an expert. You think percentage points. You understand them. To most people, it's just a big number. 443, okay, big number. Think about the last time you shopped for megapixels on a camera. That's how most people feel with the numbers that you give them. It's some random number that some dude is telling you 12 megapixels. I guess, good. A study showed the big difference this can have. They showed people either the left-hand side before they were about to take a payday loan or the right-hand side. Here they were told, if you repay the payday lender, you would pay $45 for a 2-week loan. If you did the same thing on your credit card, you put it in $250. Now, those are numbers that make sense to people. Why? Dollars make sense to people. Just showing this presentation on the right, I'm not even saying that's the best presentation. I'm just saying now you're talking the person's language. Decrease actual payday borrowing by about 6 percentage points. Just showing them the two different tables. And these are real payday loans of about 1,000 borrowers. Here's another example of how taking the person's perspective. John Kerry, in speaking to women voters in Milwaukee, said, imagine if the roughly 38 million women who didn't vote in 2000 came together and said, we need a president who's on our side. Let's look at that phrase. The roughly 38 million women who didn't vote in 2000. What is it John Kerry is saying from his perspective, from where he's sitting? He's looking at that and saying, you should vote. You can make a difference. From the voter's perspective, what might he be saying? He's saying, no one votes. It's fine not to vote. 38 million people don't vote. I'm happy to not vote. Those are two very different things from the same phrase. And in fact, I hate to tell you this, but John Kerry is wrong. P. Diddy is wrong. Hillary Clinton is wrong. When you do these studies, what you find is that when you tell people turnout is going to be high, people turn out. When you tell people turnout is going to be low and we need your vote, nobody comes. That's one of the most powerful findings that you have is when people look at these messages, they take away the descriptive norm, the description of what people like them are doing, not the injunctive norm, the statement that you're trying to make of what you should be doing. And that's, I think, a common failure of expertise. Here's an example of, let me skip this in the interest of time. I'm going to show you this is a real example of a communication failure from giving perspective. This is right here in Brooklyn. Yes, I don't know if you've seen this. This was outside of a friend of mine, his apartment building. 7,000 high school students drop out every day. That's a stack of desks, 12 Empire State Buildings high. This is probably a very good ad. Unfortunately, to some people, this is an ad for dropping out. So if you're in the dropping out lobby, this is probably a good ad for that population. They're trying to do something else with this as well, but unfortunately for them, this is located right in front of this. It's an unfortunate consequence. But that's the sense in which, because when we're focusing on communication, we're focusing so much on what we want, the injunctive norm. Oh, we are focused from our perspective what people should be doing. We forget the descriptive norm that's implicit in so much of what we do. Okay, so that's my second point. I worry that you know too much, and the biggest failures I've seen in communication come from an excess of knowledge, not recognizing how big the gap is between what you know and what the other person knows, and they're not interested in learning what you know. They just want to sit where they are and listen to you. Finally, I'm going to talk about my last thing, which is the work I'm doing now, which also involves communication, which is I think that in a lot of the communication work we do, we are wasting the scarcest resource of all. I think you could think of a variety of scarce resources. And I'm going to argue today that in our work, I've found the scarcest resource of all. All right. Even if you don't believe me, at least you'll know I said something extreme. I'm going to start with, this is work I'm doing with Eldar Shafir, who's a Princeton psychologist. I'm going to start with a very early study. This is the Minnesota hunger study. This happened near the end of World War II. The Allies were freeing up many, many areas of Germany at that point, or at least some parts, or at least captured territories. And what they were freeing up was whole areas that had been starving or near starvation, and soldiers who had been prisoners of war who had been near starvation. And what the army wanted to know was, how are we going to refeed these people? What should we do? Should we give them small amounts of food, so they work their way back up? Should we give them a lot of food at once? Will their system go into shock? We need to know. And the scientists said, we don't have an answer for you because nobody knows, but we can run an experiment. So they recruited able-bodied men. The first phase of the experiment was, we're going to starve you. So they starved these able-bodied men in Minnesota for about 6 months. And you might wonder who volunteers for this study. Lots of people volunteer for this study. Why? This is World War II. You were a conscientious objector. You want to do your part. And you were able-bodied enough to participate in the study, but something kept you from actually being in the war. These men volunteered, and in that process, ironically, though this was a refeeding study, it's where we learned the most we'll ever learn about hunger, or at least the beginning of what we learned. And some of the things were obvious today. For example, we learned that aerobic capacity goes down. Some of the things are less obvious, and most people don't realize it. For example, weight loss doesn't happen the way you think. So people lose some weight, and then they start to gain weight. That's edema. That's because now they're bloating and they're retaining water. So actually the men's weight loss kind of does this. But that's for another day. What we've learned that was really interesting for what I'm going to tell you about this very scarce resource is not what happened to the men's bodies, but what happened to the men's minds. Most of it was unexpected. This is footnotes in the study. The men started spending all their free time studying cookbooks. They would compare the price of food in restaurants, in newspapers. You ask them, what are you going to do after you graduate? They say, I'm going to open a restaurant. They're not going to open a restaurant. None of these men went and opened a restaurant. But what was going on here, you can see their mind, being physically hungry, their mind immediately focused on food. The researchers reported one scene where the men went to watch a funny movie. And they all sat in one part of the thing. And they said it was kind of freaky because during the funny scenes, if there was any food in the scene, the men would not laugh at all. They were just focused on the food. Their attention was captured by the thing they lacked. Think of what that means, that when you lack something, your attention is automatically captured. The men didn't go to the movie and say, you know what I'd love to be thinking about now while I'm hungry? Food. They don't want to be thinking about that. They're automatically thinking about that. So we know since then that actually this process happens at the level of milliseconds. What do I mean by that? Well, in one more recent study, 50 years later, 60 years later, they brought subjects into the lab, not hungry this time, but thirsty. They said, don't drink water for a certain... I really want to drink water now. I should grab something. This is not a joke. Luckily, I'm not rebutting any State of the Union. The people wanted to give... they brought them in and they were thirsty. And they said that half of you were going to give water to. So now they're not thirsty anymore. They're sated. The other half, and this is why it's really fun being in psychology. The other half, they said, here's some pretzels. So now you have some really thirsty people and some not thirsty people. And then they did something which psychologists call the lexical decision task. The lexical decision task is the closest we've come so far to being able to pry open your skull and read your mind. What it is it's not an fMRI or anything. It's a kind of an old technique, but it's beautiful. The way it works is you show letters like this on a screen. Chair. That happens to be a real word, so you would hit this button. Then you tell people, if it's not a real word, like this one, you hit this other button. How quickly can you recognize that something is a real word or not? Does that make sense? It's just strings of letters. I gave this in Norway, and I had this moment of like, oh my god, what if this turns out to be a... I'm told it's not a word, though it probably is a piece of IKEA furniture. And then they were told a bunch of these things. Now, as you can see from the list here, what they found was that in response to the non-words or the words that have nothing to do with thirst, the thirsty and the non-thirsty were responded at the same rate. We're talking about 150, 200 milliseconds. You can't control this. But once the word water showed up, or soda, or anything related to thirst, the thirsty were much quicker to respond. Quicker at a level that we know is below automatic control. That's the level at which their attention is now automatically captured by the thing they lack. Why am I telling you all this? Because a lot of problems that we focus on involve people experiencing some form of scarcity. The hungry were lacking food, their mind was caught by food. The thirsty were lacking water, their mind was captured by water. Now, we often aren't dealing with thirsty people, or luckily not very often hungry people, but we are dealing with a lot of people who are scarce in, say, money. And I'm going to show you that the same effect has a pretty extreme consequence, one that's much, much bigger, and will lead us to what the most scarce resource is. So what's that consequence? I'm going to start off with a fun little experiment we did. This is just fun. We gave subjects a word search. We said, hey, find the word street, then find the word tree. You know, the middle, the grid, resets every time. Find the word tree, find the word picture or cloud. Half the subjects were given that. The other half were given the same word search, but now I feel like some 70s secret camera show. We've secretly replaced every other word with a tasty word. Street becomes cake, picture becomes donut, and on and on. Okay? What we were interested in was both groups would be searching for one word, say tree, but one of them would have just searched for a neutral word, and the other would have just searched for cake. What difference did it make? It turned out that for half the subjects, roughly, it didn't make any difference. I don't care. I saw cake, I find tree, just as fast as if I saw street, I find tree. But there was one group for whom it made a big difference. Any guesses who they were? Close to hungry. Dieters. The dieters were much slower to find the word tree if they had just looked for the word cake. It's because their mind was still on cake. They weren't searching as fast. This is a microcosm of something that I think is really important. Picture yourself, say now you're not a dieter, say you need to make rent this month. And you are sitting, and your boss is explaining to you, this is the new fryer. This is how it works. You have to do this and this. If you screw this up, it's going to, burn out the fuse, or we're going to have to reset it and do it all over again. Now, some chance you heard. Some chance that while he was mentioning that, you said, oh my God, how am I going to make rent this month? What happened? In that moment, your mind was not all there. Part of your mind was elsewhere. So it's as if the same process, this capture of attention, leads you, and this is what I was going to call as the scarcest resource of all, our bandwidth, our mental bandwidth, is now being taxed. Being poor doesn't just mean having very little money. It means having your attention constantly pulled elsewhere. Being busy, as many of you know, doesn't mean just having very little time. It means when you're sitting in a meeting, part of your mind goes to, oh man, I've got this other thing to do. So the way I often think about it is that, a repeat of that, is that we ought to be able to see this. And how should we be able to see this? We've done some studies recently, one in a mall in New Jersey and one in India, two very extreme different places, all of which are looking at income. Okay, it's one form of scarcity and an important form of scarcity. And here's what we did. We showed some people in the mall, we brought them in, and we gave them two types of tasks. One is the Raven's progressive matrices. Do you all know what this is? You've almost all taken it, and in a fit of hatred, you've blocked it out of your minds. This is how we decide what flexible intelligence is. This is a key part of IQ. It's the most robust part of IQ. The way it works is, for example, hey, look, there's this hole here. Which of these pictures fits in that hole? What do you put there? There are many such tests. And this is very, very predictive and correlated. This is one of the key components of a part of IQ. The other one is called a cognitive control task. Cognitive control task is very simple. You're told, hey, look, hit the button. When you see a heart, hit the same side as the heart. But when you see a flower, hit the opposite side. Now, that's a hard task. Why? Because when you see the heart, you're like, great. And then you see a flower, you want to hit the flower. And then you have to hesitate. It's a good measure of self-control, and it's quite predictive. Okay, what did we do? Well, we gave the rich and the poor in the mall both these tasks. And the poor did slightly worse, not that different on both these tasks. Then we gave the rich and the poor, another group of rich and poor, the task. But before they took the task, we said, hey, before you take this task, I just want you to think hypothetically, if you needed $1,000, how would you get it? That's it. We just tickled that part of their brain. And what we found is, this is when nothing was tickled, but when something was tickled, a huge drop in Raven's matrices accuracy. They did far, far fewer Ravens. How big is this effect? Well, this is about 13 IQ points. Or put it another way, people have done studies where they've taken people and they've made them sleepless for an entire day, for an entire night, kept them up. You can imagine the next day they're not very cognitively fully awake. Then you give them Ravens. The effect of a full night of sleeplessness is about 80% of what we find. So the effect of just income or just thinking about poverty on bandwidth is very high. Of course, we did a lot of manipulation, so we decided to go to India, same on cognitive control. We decided to go to India and look at sugarcane farmers. Why sugarcane farmers? Sugarcane farmers get their income all in 1 year. I mean, all in 1 month. Okay? And so their income, their annual income is given once. That's because the harvest is once a year. That means the month before harvest, they're pretty poor. The month after harvest, they're pretty rich. The same person we get to see when they're poor and when they're rich. We didn't do anything. We didn't like trigger them or do anything. We just said, let me give an IQ test to that person when they're poor, and let me give an IQ test to that same person when they're rich. And what we found is roughly the same effect. Now there's no experimental effect. Big drop in Raven's accuracy, and big drop in, this is a slightly different control task like heart flower. All of this is by way of saying that this bandwidth is extremely taxed for the poor, but also extremely taxed for the busy, extremely taxed for a lot of people. And so what I would ask you to think about is, I'd ask you to think about the following metaphor. I don't know what time it is, so I'm trying to figure out. It's 4:10 p.m., is that right? No, that's not. That's just 4:20. Then maybe let me skip the metaphor. Let me just tell you this. Every time we do stuff to people, we further tax bandwidth. We further use bandwidth. When we give people communications of some form and we ask them to process new information, that requires bandwidth. When we ask people to exert self-control, that requires bandwidth. When we ask people to change habits, that requires bandwidth. In all the work we do, we are actually using this unpriced or requiring this unpriced resource of bandwidth. And I don't think we're very cognizant of when are people high in bandwidth, when are people ready to listen to us. Are we using the bandwidth that people are giving us well? It's not as if we can communicate everything we want and get them to listen to everything, and there's this free resource, the human mind, which is just going to absorb everything we want. That's not true. There's a very limited resource. People only be able to absorb part of it. And so therefore, are you using it on the part that really matters? Okay, so those are the three I just want to talk about: preaching the converted, knowing too much, and I feel like we're sort of wasting the scarce resource, not using it very effectively. Let me stop there, and I guess we'll move to conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll start a little discussion, and then we'll open the discussion out to the floor. And if you have questions, we'll take questions even from our web audience out there. You can ask a question via Twitter or email. The email is science@spitfirestrategies.com, and you can ask a question, and we'll try to answer it from here. I have this very interesting stuff to talk about. You talked about the scarcest resource of all. Did you ever measure what the value of time is in people's lives? Where do people use time as a judgment? I have a pet theory. Never tried it out. Maybe you can find out for me. You know, it's always said that as we get older, we sleep less and less, and we maybe get 4 hours sleep as we get older into our senior years, And they say that's a biological thing. My pet theory is it's not a biological thing. You just begin to understand and appreciate time more. And you know that time as you get older is fleeting, and you don't want to spend more of it sleeping. So as you get older, you realize I want to be awake a little bit more because there's a lot more stuff I want to do on my bucket list. How do you measure time as a value?
So
communication.
I didn't get a chance to talk too much about that. But, one of the things that I found thinking about scarcity very helpful for is it helps me, in a sense, solve the other problem I mentioned of egocentric bias. I am not poor, and it's easy to pretend that you understand what being poor is like, but probably you don't. But on the other hand, I am busy, and there's a little bit of scarcity of time that translates to scarcity of money. So I'll give you an example of studies on scarcity of time that have done exactly what you're talking about. They take undergraduates in their senior year when they have very little time left in their college experience. And in fact, what you find is getting them to see that dramatically changes how they spend the last 3 months, exactly of the way you describe. They go to a lot more college events. They stop loafing around. They suddenly realize the scarcity of this resource they have. And there's a little bit of work done on time scarcity as people age. And it definitely fits exactly as you're saying, that also as people age, they realize the scarcity of time and they start spending the time much more judiciously. They make trade-offs. I don't want to go to that thing. Whereas before they might have been like, okay, fine, I was invited, I might as well. They become more miserly, so to speak, with their time.
Well, how would you use that as a communication technique?
Yeah, so I think that one of the underappreciated features of communication is the ability to emphasize certain forms of scarcity and to sort of bring that scarcity out. For example, the times which I feel like energy has really been very effective, if you think about it, is all of a sudden, it's not just that the price has gone up, but the feeling of, oh my God, we have very little energy, which obviously is all an illusion. I mean, we've always had very little energy left, or we've always had a lot, but the ability to communicate that sense of scarcity of certain resources, I think, can have a very big effect. That things are running out is a very, very powerful message.
How powerful is? I remember there were some studies released a few months ago, maybe not even that long time ago, about how influential our friends and our social media are in getting you to do these things.
Yeah. There's been more and more work on this of the following variety. One, that social influence is incredibly powerful, but the wrinkle, the thing that I think a lot of people might not appreciate, is the descriptive norm part of that. That the social influence, at least partly, and in some studies fully, comes from not your friends, not the ad that says your friends are doing this, but just the pure observation that lots of people are doing this. In other words, there's a distinction between social influence that's so overt, where it's like, hey, Ira, I love this, you should try this. Then you're like, well, I'm not like you, I dress so much better. But if you, yeah, exactly. That type of influence, there's some evidence for, but there's much stronger evidence of the influence of just seeing what others are doing. So to the extent that you want to promote social influence, the ability to see what others are doing can make such a big difference. So for example, we don't know in most cases what people are doing to conserve energy in their home. We know that they're driving a Prius though. So seeing lots of Priuses on the road does have an effect. So the ability to transform the private a little bit into the observable, I think, is one of the biggest angles of social. So for example, when Facebook did the voting badge, I think just the fact that you saw so many of those badges, I think, is one of the reasons in those studies they found such a big effect.
Why is it taking so long in terms of people seeing things? People are seeing now there's no ice in the North Pole in the summertime. They're seeing the weather changes. They're seeing all kinds of stuff. Yet it's so hard for some people to accept the concept of global climate change or global warming. What is going on in people's minds here?
For me, I would just start with the two basic principles that I was talking about at the end. One, you see it, experts see it. I would guess that if we just surveyed most people, they may have read a report once, a while back. They may remember it, but most of their life, most of their bandwidth is not filled with this. It's a tiny fraction of their world. If you just surveyed, if you counted thoughts and said how many thoughts go to this problem, 1 in 100,000, 1 in, so I think that just the mind share that these ideas are getting are so much lower. And the starting point I think I would have is just starting with the recognition that it's not that people have fully processed all this. The experts know it, but most people have gotten a very thin slice of it, a glimmer of it. And then they've sort of made up their mind or thought they've seen something. And that I think is one of the biggest gaps, and it's hard for us who know it to fully appreciate how big that gap is. And I think I was mentioning this to you earlier, whenever you survey people on their beliefs and dig a little bit deeper, you quickly realize how different beliefs are than experts. One of my favorite of these is organ donation. When you ask people who are not donating, why are you not donating? 50% of them say, oh, if I donate an organ, the doctor will have less incentive to save me if I'm sick.
They really say that?
50%. It's not a foolish belief. They're not experts. And if you go to an intuitive model of the way the world works, okay, that's fine. But it just shows you the depth to which there can be a pretty big gap between the beliefs and the knowledge and understanding that people have.
Mm-hmm. Yet, how about the notion that people don't want to give up their beliefs because they belong to a social community of believers, and that would force them to step outside?
Yeah, I think the two biggest defensive walls that people have for their beliefs are, one, what psychologists call confirmatory bias. Every one of us has this. You believe something, you want to be right. You really want to be right. Now that's one wall. But the other wall is when the belief is not about you being right, but it's about something you care about. You want to believe that your team is going to win the Super Bowl. You know, people tell you otherwise, you want to believe it. It's us. One of the things that I think is happening in recent times is the merging of these two forces, where confirmatory bias is meeting the social bias, where now buying into climate change is also a matter of buying into the other side. And I think the polarization where now scientific beliefs or lots of beliefs are getting equated with us versus them is going to make the walls particularly hard to scale. It's no longer an abstract, oh, I was wrong about that. It's a, well, I'm not one of those guys. And I think that makes it incredibly hard to scale.
Mm. Sometimes issues, and we as journalists do this, we try to create false equivalences. If we, and you see this a lot on a lot of the news, so-called news programs, that if there is a climate denier or doubter, they'll have one person who's the doubter, and they'll have one person who is, you know, a scientist who represents 97% of the world. And by putting one and one, you get to believe there's an equivalence between the two views. How do you get around that? I mean, does that really influence the way people view the issue as you are staging it?
Well, I think that has an enormous effect. There are many studies going back 30 years now where all you need to do to get confirmatory bias to feed on itself is to give people even a little bit of evidence, however potentially flawed, because they'll see that part of the evidence and seize upon it. And the idea of putting, now, I don't know what that means for your job, but what I do know is the idea of putting sort of one really good piece of evidence and one flawed piece of evidence next to each other and saying, well, you, the audience judge, we know what that's going to happen when you do that. People are going to see what they want to see. There's a wonderful study called They Saw a Game, where they had two people watch the same game, and it's clear the angle from which you saw it, completely dependent on what you wanted to believe.
Mm-hmm. What if you have questions in the audience, you want to ask a question, just they'll bring the microphones over to you. What about the using you talked about the competitive side.
Yeah.
How can you use the competitive side? You know, it used to be keeping up with the Joneses is the way they used to describe it in the old days.
Yeah, I think that that I didn't get to go into this, but there's a wonderful company in Alexandria that has used exactly this. It used both keeping up with the Joneses and just descriptive norms. All they do, and I'm sure many of you get this letter now in the mail, all they do is they send a letter along with your bill that says, here's how much energy you used. Here's how much your neighbors who have houses of similar size use. That's a very simple thing to send, and there's huge randomized control trials. That alone has had a large effect on energy use in the homes that receive those letters. So much so that now they have, in their short time of existence, they've already saved as much energy as taking 2 medium-sized cities off the grid.
Wow.
just from that, and that's the competitive side at some level.
Well, let me. Do we have a question? Somebody on the mic? Yes, in the audience over there.
Hi, yeah. I'm Nancy Schwartz, and I'm a strategist and blogger at gettingattention.org. I, wholeheartedly agree with what you say about the curse of knowledge and egocentric bias, and we in the nonprofit sector have heard a lot about it. With the Heath brothers have done a lot of speaking at various conferences. We can sit here now and totally agree with you, and I'm sure most of us does. But there's a huge cultural change that has to be made for folks, I think, especially leadership, to let go of what the organization wants, that organizational bias, and to truly focus on, for nonprofit supporters or for grant maker, grantees, or the folks behind the issues, what are strategies you may suggest to help make that cultural shift?
I should ask you. I mean, I am actually curious. What would you say? I mean, you've thought about it.
Well, I mean, I thought I do sort of scare techniques sometimes that are very much like, your scarcity solution. For example, showing folks what other organizations are doing. Also have as many different kinds of dialogues as possible with the people you're trying to reach and move. So those are a few things.
So
but people stay stuck.
Yeah, one thing I would say, building on the second one that you said, is that I have found it astonishing how the right survey, the right quantitative survey, can make a big difference. Because part of what, and I'll tell you exactly what I mean. What I mean is, like, when I told you the organ donation fact, if that weren't from a survey, and I just said to you, who really believe in the importance of organ donation, that like most people are worried, you say, no one's going to be worried about that. Come on. I say, well, guess what? We surveyed 5,000 people or 1,000 people, and half of them said they are worried about that. And I think that one of the most useful things, which we don't do very often, is actually surveys where we quantitatively elicit beliefs. I think quickly we'll see how different. When I told you mind share is very small on the ice caps melting, I bet you most of you, and even you, Ira, say, yeah, maybe, without really hard data where we actually really can see what people do believe at a granular level. I think it is hard to convince experts. I find that with my students. I read this paper and I go, no one's going to understand what you're saying. Say, how could they not understand what I'm saying? Well, no one's going to understand it. And I think I would argue that type of data can be very helpful.
Is that something you've talked about, overconfidence? Is that what overconfidence leads to?
Yeah, I think what I would argue is this is much deeper than overconfidence, because overconfidence people tend to think of as kind of like an overconfidence of self. This is the deepest sense in which you look at the world from your angle, and we undercorrect when I say, let me try and look from Ira's angle. We just don't move far enough. Nick Epley, who's a wonderful psychologist, works on this, and he calls it mind reading, and how we're very bad at mind reading. That it is just hard for me to put myself fully in your shoes. And so I think that we don't do that very often. We collect data on outcomes, we collect data on impacts, but the right data point on that could really help shake us up.
Because we make assumptions about how other people think.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're a poor person, we make an assumption about how you think as a poor person versus how if you had money.
Exactly.
Are those assumptions correct?
Exactly. And I think in a lot of times they are very wrong. We look at the employee who doesn't get the act of the friar, and we say, well, that's because they don't care. It's not that they don't care. They have something else on their mind. And so a lot of times, that's a good way of putting it, a lot of times we fall prey to the assumptions we make about others, and as with most things, data and quantification can make a big difference. If we quantify the assumptions, we'll quickly see we're wrong.
We should always ask for the facts, ma'am.
Yeah, exactly.
Just the facts. It's always hard, show me the data.
Exactly.
Show me where's the beef, and we don't ask those questions enough. I don't think.
And I need a trench coat. I think it's
a trench coat. Yes. Who's got a mic over here? Yes.
Sendhil, I'll give you two questions. Let you pick which one to answer.
Oh, that's great.
First, in terms of IQ scarcity impact, poor people are in need of financial literacy education. Putting financial literacy questions in front of them implies that we make them stupid by trying to go through this process. We're lowering their IQ by making this very salient to them. Is there a way out of that problem of getting to the people who are scarce by presenting them information about that scarcity and lowering their IQ? And then second, you referenced the O-Power studies, and you have a paper that the effects place to place were very, very different, although they were still there, but they changed pretty radically place to place. how much do we really understand about those effects, and how much faith should we put in those findings, given how variant across the studies, not only with the no power, but across how big the changes and effects are?
Let me take the first one because it's easy. The interesting thing about financial literacy, and it goes back to your point about when you realize time is scarce. When the poor realize money is scarce, I didn't talk about this. Because they focus on it, they're actually much more financially literate than you imagine. So it goes back to just the facts. When we do classic judgment decision-making studies involving money, things that I can get my undergrads to screw up on all the time, to get MBAs to screw up on all the time. Some would say that's even easier. The poor don't make those mistakes. They're actually remarkably financially savvy because they focus on the dollar a lot. So in some sense, the first thing I would say about financial literacy is we shouldn't, that's not to say they're fully literate, but we shouldn't presume the exact level of illiteracy they have. It certainly appears to be, their literacy appears higher than ours. The second thing I would say is that, going back to communication, I feel like a lot of financial literacy is written by the wrong person. Like it's not, so there have been recent studies done on rules of thumb, for example, in other countries, and they found giving people simple rules of thumb on how to manage their business is far more effective than teaching them double entry, bookkeeping, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of room left to be done on that. I don't know if that helps.
Who had I saw, yes, so.
Yeah, this has been extremely enlightening and maybe at base also rather depressing for organizations that in this room that style themselves, one, on being on their work being based on evidence and the facts, and that see themselves as that style themselves as being rather scientific in their approach, in their funding decisions, and in others. So, is it simply a matter of communicating the facts better, or is it understanding the or is it more understanding the psychology of your of the audience that you're trying to reach? That's sort of the key to get us out of this rather depressing bind, I think.
I would say the second by far. I think that we spend so much time focusing on what we're trying to communicate and far too little time focusing on where the person is who we're trying to talk to. So if we just said, forget what I'm trying to tell them, forget all that I believe about climate change, forget all of that stuff. Let me just go out and spend some time understanding, what do people believe about this? What evidence did they find compelling to get to that point? Data collection on that front could really, I think, open up a lot of vistas. And I think that's oftentimes, in basic writing, they tell you to go where the person is. Don't expect them to come to you. And I think we somehow have forgotten that.
So you say that we do not collect enough information about who the audience is.
We collect information about demographics, et cetera, but about where they are mentally on a problem, not nearly that.
Because you always hear, "Oh, just give me your zip code and I'll know everything about it."
Exactly.
Just what they want on the website. Just put your name and your zip code and we'll know everything about what you're saying. That's not enough.
I would say that's so far from. In other words, that might do pretty well to help predict. My zip code may help me predict whether I'm going to vote for person A or for person B, but it's not going to tell me what I really need to know, which is, what is it I think about climate change? What are the pieces of evidence I found convincing? How often do I think about it? What are the false beliefs I may have? Those are the things that if we want to move the person, we would need to understand. We don't, like, for example, I don't even know whether most people in thinking about climate change currently believe or know or have much knowledge. Now, some of this has been collected. I don't want to overstate the case, but have much knowledge about, are the ice caps melting? I heard something about ice caps melting. I don't know.
But they have to make them admit that all the research they've been doing all these years is wrong. Right? They would have to be able to say to you, I think advertisers really don't know who their audience is half the time because they're proven wrong all the time about who's buying what. But they pass down information from generation of advertisers to generations. Instead of doing refreshing their research. So you're saying that you have to be willing to admit, gee, we've been doing this all wrong for all these years. And a lot of people may not want to admit that. Maybe their boards don't want to hear that.
I think that's right. The one thing I've been impressed with in the nonprofit space is there is an eagerness and a thirst to do things differently, because most people in the space are in it because they want to make a difference, and we see that on intractable problems, on many of them, we do feel a little stuck. I think you're right. There's always a natural human reluctance, but there
Yeah.
is also some interest in, okay, let's give it a shot, because it's not, maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I think everyone in this room is a terrific person. And
If you weren't optimistic, you wouldn't be in a nonprofit.
exactly.
Yes, over here.
This is a question from the live stream. Zarina asks, at the end, you mentioned that we utilize, require, and take bandwidth from others in the ways that we communicate. But can you describe ways that we can give, get more, or expand that bandwidth?
I think a lot of social programs we would view very differently. So I'll give you one of my favorite examples. Low-income individuals in the U.S., one of the things that they report constantly thinking about, even when they can't decide about it, is childcare. Who's going to pick up my kid? Where will I take my kid? You know, it's just a constant concern and a constant source of. Now, think about childcare programs that provide some childcare, Head Start, you know, a variety of them, or you could even go further down the chain. When we look to measure the impact of a program like that, we often focus on what did it do to the child, maybe what did it do to mother's earnings, etc. But if you thought that that program was building IQ, you would view that program fundamentally differently. And so I think there are a lot of programs we have in our portfolio right now who are having benefits on dimensions we don't even bother to measure. Another example is people often report huge concerns around it. I'm not sure why I'm looking at you, given that you just gave it from the live stream. I should be looking out into the ether, but
Right in the camera there.
right in the camera.
Yeah, right.
And that question felt longer than 140 letters. But another example is a lot of people, when they have like an emergency shock, a car breaks down, they become very focused on where will I get the money and run around. So even a small financial product that tries to deal with those type of bumps in the road could have not just an effect on income, but an effect on bandwidth, which we rarely measure. So I think part of what I would say is there are a lot of things that are already doing that. We just don't see it.
How do you figure out what you don't know? How do you know what you don't know and go get that information? Is that possible?
That's a really good question.
I mean, everybody, you know, I talk to scientists all the time, and that always is a major question. How do I know what I don't know? How do I know what the dark energy is mad at? I don't know what I don't know about, you know, the Higgs boson and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's the same thing applied to every other walk of life, I would think, any other kind of research.
Yeah. It is one thing I've found to be particularly bad at finding out what you don't know, but it gives people the illusion that they've done it, is qualitative interviewing. Because most of us, we go into a qualitative interview, and very often you come back with things closely in the constellation of things you've already believed. And that's because we tend to ask or guide the conversation towards things. One of the things that extremely good sociologists are terrific at are doing qualitative interviewing without that bias. And I think that skill is a terrific skill. And if there was a way to get more of that embedded in the population, it's nothing more than the ability to listen and to not ask questions that have prejudgment and guiding in the direction. And sociologists are terrific at this. There's an older tradition in anthropology of embedding people for 3 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, deeply within the social fabric. I think all of those are diminishing a little bit with the quantitative data that we're getting, and I think that's a tragedy, because that is the most interesting advances in social science have come from that type of activity.
There's a question over here.
Hi, I really enjoyed the talk, so thank you. So I'm in healthcare, and I'm interested in the idea of incentivization around behavior change. So in one sense, I think of this at a systems level. So in the healthcare system, a lot of the projects that I work on use the idea of being at risk for patient outcomes, or the idea of shared savings to incentivize systems to perform to a certain level, but also certainly at the patient level, the idea of creating some kind of incentivization to get people to focus on a particular behavior. And I've seen a lot of studies that say as long as the incentive is there, people are willing to change their behavior, but if you take the incentive away, the behavior doesn't stick. And some of the question to me is, maybe we just haven't found the right kind of incentive. I'm just curious if you could speak a little bit to that.
You used a very important word. You were talking about incentives as a way to focus people on the behavior. And I think that's something that's often overlooked. People think of incentives as, I'm going to change the cost-benefit calculus. For some behaviors, that's the case. I don't want to buy this car. You make it 20% cheaper. Okay, I'll buy it. But for a lot of cases, the incentive is only going to work if it enters in a moment of when I'm going to make the mistake. So take the glow caps example. It's the reminder, that thing in the moment, that led me to open the thing. So thinking of incentives as focusing devices is, I think, really important. It changes the nature of incentives. My favorite examples of this are the 5-year term limit on TANF. So I don't know if you guys know how this works. This is what used to be called the AFTC. We wanted to incentivize people to not stay on welfare, so we gave them a 5-year term limit. A 5-year term limit? Talk about something that doesn't enter into the tunnel of everyday life until very much near the end. That's an example of a very big incentive that fails to focus. That's the worst case scenario. Huge incentives that fail to focus. Small incentives that focus you a lot are very, very helpful. People have found tiny little incentives that get paid out at a daily level or at a weekly level can have an unseasonably big impact. And as to whether incentives persist, there are actually some pretty good studies that when used as a focusing device, incentives can persist very powerfully. So if not used in this, let me convince you way, but in this, let me get you to the gym by kind of getting you on the right path and developing a habit, people have found that when you remove that micro-focusing incentive, people continue to stay going to the gym. And that's just because a habit has been formed, which is presumably what you want in a lot of behaviors.
What about using social media to get you to do these things? Because everybody will know if you're doing it or not.
And I would say in the other direction as well, which is if you think about going to the gym, the trainer is such a useful tool for getting you to the gym, mainly because he or she focuses you. You know that person is waiting for you there at 9 a.m. Oh, I've got to go. And in some funny way, the social element, I think of attention as one of the most important commodities out there. And our friends and the people around us, nothing captures our attention as quickly as people around us. So if you want to go to the gym, yes, a small incentive can work, but so could signing up with a buddy and saying, why don't you and I set some dates ahead of time to go to the gym? Partly it's because they'll see what I'm going to do, but also just because my mind is on the thing now. And so I think social elements are very powerful.
And now you have the ability to track whether you're doing it or not.
Exactly.
I mean, somebody will remind you or nag you or have you as a buddy or monitor your glucose level for you and say, you missed an insulin and that sort of thing.
And in adherence, you're completely right. The biggest predictor across all categories, across countries, of whether people adhere to drugs is the social support system that they have, which is there someone around to remind you and say, hey, you didn't take that? And that has such a big effect.
That was an amazing statistic about, we think just the opposite about adherence to drug regimen. Yeah. Wow. Do we have another question here? Somebody have a question? What would you, we're almost out of time. Do we have anything from the internet we can ask? No. Where would you say the biggest challenge is and the biggest reward then in what you were talking about today?
For me, I think the biggest challenge is going to be, I love what GlowCaps has done, and to me that's the next big frontier. What do I mean by that? I mean that instead of sticking to our old media of communications, messages, maybe now it's ads on Facebook, whatever it might be, instead of sticking to our traditional communications tool, GlowCaps has said, really synthesized down and said, my communications problem is I want to deliver a reminder at a pretty high frequency level. Let me build a channel to allow that. So I'm going to engineer a new pill bottle. I think that is the marriage of technology really aimed at solving a fundamental communication problem. And I think we're going to see more things along those lines. That is, I think we're going to start seeing really, and now because technology has gotten so cheap and we've got those ability to do that, I think we're going to start seeing that. You mentioned this pedometer. I think these things that you wear that kind of tell you how many steps you've taken, that's starting to go in that direction. And they all have the similar feature of once you've synthesized down the very specific problem, in that case, I don't really know how often I've been active. Well, if that's the angle we want to do, then we can start to do a lot more.
And, let me get the mic to you before somebody have a, all right, give it a shot. She's got one.
I'd like to go back to one of the macro issues because the thing about the pillbox and the alarm clock is it's relevant to the person, you know, directly. Let's go back to global warming. Most people have never seen a polar bear except in the zoo, and they've never been to the Antarctic or the Arctic, and they don't really get it. They don't really believe it, and it's not really relevant. Okay, so you're not going to bring the polar bear on the little, you know, piece of ice. How would you approach changing these ingrained either indifference or the sense that it's a lie, you know, which polluters and carbon big footprint people would like us to believe. How would you approach that from a sociological standpoint?
So I think I would say that there is very low-hanging fruit on that problem that we are not addressing. So I'll give you my two favorite examples. Programmable thermostats that people don't program. Now that seems small, but if you just did a back-of-the-envelope calculation on if you got everyone in America to program their programmable thermostat, the amount of energy we would save is very sizable. Second, the number of people who do not have a programmable thermostat is huge. Now I think that's what's so asymmetric. I think oftentimes when we think about macro problems, we overlook all of the micro behavioral problems that actually buttress it. I know this is not a solution for getting the percentage of people who say I believe in global warming to move up, but I do think it's a solution for reducing the amount of energy that we use. And there's some really interesting work that's starting to be done on what would an easy-to-use thermostat look like so that I can actually program it easily.
It's kind of like hand washing with germs.
Right, exactly.
That I'm not going to wipe out malaria or whatever, but I've washed my hands and I've cut 85% of the germs, you know, in my little.
That's right.
All right, last question, I think. Time.
Am I on? I can't tell. I have a follow-up question to yours or statement. One is the language that we use. So for so long, the words global warming were ingrained in our head, and that feels very abstract to people who are not experiencing what they think of global warming, the polar bears and the ice and everything. But when you talk about climate change, it makes it much more relevant to everybody. And you can't say that, or many people would argue, myself included, that all these snowstorms and hurricanes and crazy weather we're having here in the Northeast is related to climate change. But it's not. If I said it was related to global warming, you would say, well, how? It's not warm, you know. So it's a language thing sometimes, and helping bring people along, even someone like yourself, probably with great intentions, just adjusting your language a little bit to make it relevant to your audience. Loved your talk, by the way. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
I want to say thank you on behalf of the Communications Network and Spitfire. I'm Bruce Trachtenberg, Executive Director of the Communications Network. Ira, Sendhil, thank you. I also just want to suggest there's one other way to incentivize people to change behavior. It worked on me today. Shame. I saw you in LA maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and you had that slide of the fitness center. I'm not taking the elevator to the first, second, or third floor in my gym ever again. So thank you for that. I want to thank all of you for coming and appreciate it. And the person who asked the question, both of you, about global warming and climate change, I invite you to visit either our website or Spitfire to look at a clip of a presentation we had in November by Dan Kahan of Yale, talking about why people, no matter what you describe it, refuse to believe in either global warming or climate change because of things you were talking today about their cultural affiliation. So on behalf of all of you, I want to say thank you for being here. And on behalf of all of us, I want to say thank you for being here and appreciate your good questions and your being a great audience. Thank you.